Can we see the screen?
Yeah,
Yes, I
we
can
see.
see it, Abhishek.
Okay. Okay.
You can just slideshow पे डाल दो.
Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks you, Siddharth, for organizing this, and thanks to all the doctors for joining in. It's a great privilege to do this session for doctors, where we are the most important people today, considering where we are going through the COVID situation. So I welcome Rakshit Ranjan from Marcellus Investment Managers. Rakshit is a CFA charter holder and one of the founding members of the Marcellus PMS team. They are managing more than 7,000 crores now. And without further ado, I will just give to Rakshit himself to explain what Marcellus does. And if after this session, so there'll be like a 35-40 minute session, and then we have a Q&A. You can please put them in the chat box, and we will answer as many as them possible one by one. Over to you, Rakshit.
Sure. Thanks, Abhishek. And good morning. Good morning to all the doctors on a Sunday morning, especially during times like these when I'm sure there are too many calls in the time. Abhishek, let's go to slide number 2. I'll give you a quick background about Marcellus. This is a 2.5 years old, a little over 2.5 years old organization set up by the three of us and a few other colleagues. The three of us in particular, Saurabh, Pramod, and I, we've been working together for the last 17 years. We started working together in the UK in 2004, 2005, when we used to cover UK listed equities and we used to provide investment advice to fund managers all over the world investing in UK equities. We did that, got fairly well recognized and highly ranked analysts in our respective sectors over the next 3-4 years. In 2008, 2009, we all migrated to India initially to set up the Indian subsidiary of the same parent, and then we sold off that business to a Portuguese bank and moved to a firm called Ambit Capital. At Ambit, we set up the research franchise where we were providing Indian equities research to fund managers globally. Continued doing that till 2016 when we realized that one of the flagship philosophies at Ambit that we had been offering to fund managers on an advisory basis actually is going to be a lot in demand if we run money directly of HNIs of clients from India using that philosophy. So that's when I changed verticals within Ambit to become a fund manager. We launched something called Ambit's Coffee Can PMS. Saurabh was the CIO. Pramod continued to head institutional equities. And there at the Coffee Can PMS journey of 2 years, 2017 and 18, the traction of this sort of a philosophy for clients was so high that we realized that if we really want to capitalize on the opportunity here, we need to put our skin in the game fully. And that obviously we couldn't have done from within Ambit. Hence, we decided to set up Marcellus as a firm of our own. So late 2018, we set up Marcellus. Today, as Abhishek mentioned, we are managing a little over 8,000 crores in money, and across three different products. The bulk of that being in consistent compounders, which is the product that I'm going to talk about today. So Abhishek, let's go to the next slide. So the broad construct of our approach in this philosophy is around 3 areas. First and foremost, we believe that cleanliness of accounts is probably one of the biggest value adds that an investor can have if you are very careful about it. Because Abhishek, let's go to slide 4. So if you look at the whole listed universe, no less than 80%, probably even 90% of the listed universe is an accounting fraud of a degree that you don't want to be associated with as an investor, right? And this is something which hit us hard when we set foot in India. Initially, we were taken aback. We were a little horrified that how can we operate in a country where annual report numbers don't make sense, where the promoter might be running a great business at a ground level, which makes a lot of sense for the customer, for the employees, for the promoter himself, but the promoter doesn't want to share the outcome of that greatness of the franchise with minority shareholders, and hence investors get jeopardized. But then later on, we realize that if we actually look at the degree of disclosure that the regulators here, especially MCA as well as so Ministry of Corporate Affairs as well as SEBI, they require all corporates to have, all listed entities to have. It's actually very rewarding if you build a fraud detection framework. So we built our own proprietary fraud detection framework. Snapshot of that is in the table on the left here in the screen in front of you, where we are using simple ratios, and this is all publicly available data. Just that 99.9% of the investors they don't bother about this publicly available data. But if you do that, the benefit is, wherever you see red flags, if you avoid those companies, you will certainly avoid losing a lot of money by sitting on landmines which can unexpectedly burst in your face, right? And if you can avoid losing your money big time, then making money becomes all the more easier, right? So that's why this is a step which we are quite paranoid about. So for instance, just to give you an example, ratio number 7 on the screen in front of you checks the auditor's remuneration growth compared to the growth in the business itself, right? And there are several companies which falter on this aspect. So I remember the first company, in fact, that we got hold of was using this ratio in India in 2009, when we saw that L&T and CG Power were being audited by the same auditor, and L&T was 6 times larger in size. Despite that, CG Power was giving 3 times more audit fees to the same auditor, right, compared to L&T. And these are then simple, straightforward red flags which then tell you that there's something fishy happening. Now, these landmines can take a very long time to burst, right? Until then, the stock can be the darling of the stock market, right? And CG Power in this case got unraveled only in 2018 or 2019, right? So it took a good 9 or 10 years after we spotted it for the broader market to be aware of it. But obviously, once these things get spotted, then there is no hope of even retaining 10% of your investment value in these companies. So that's something that we keep doing. We've got a team of 8 chartered accountants out of the 12 research analysts, and all of them every year keep polishing this proprietary framework further and further. And what comes out of this, out of say a BSE 500, is no more than 100 odd companies, on which then we go to the next step, which is slide 5, Abhishek, where we look at historical capital allocation track record of these companies as a next filtering criteria. Right? This again is a filtering criteria, just like the first one. And here what we are seeking is last decade or longer should have seen the company deliver a very high level of return on capital employed, at least higher than cost of capital. So return on capital employed is the money that you've invested in the business. How much return is the business delivering on that? And that money could be in fixed assets, in working capital, in intangibles, etc. How much profit is the firm generating on that invested capital? Simple logic. If you're not even generating, let's say 13-15%, which is the cost of capital for most of these businesses in India, then you actually don't deserve to exist as a company, because you're doing no good to the shareholders. So if you interestingly, if you just seek the number of companies which have delivered more than 15% return on capital every year over a 10-year period, and have also redeployed the surplus cash hence generated back into the business to deliver revenue growth of say more than nominal GDP growth every year. Remember, India's nominal GDP growth is never below say 9, 10, 11%, right? And hence if a business doesn't deliver 10% revenue growth, it's actually disappointing on multiple fronts, right? So in that regard, if you actually put these two filters over a 10-year period, no more than a couple of dozen companies, they pass the test, right? Which have clean accounts, and healthy historical capital allocation track record, right? And it's that simple. In fact, the chart on the top right shows you that if you don't do any accounting filter, you just do this historical capital allocation filter, right? And you seek a portfolio that comes out automatically, invest in that portfolio, eyes shut. You don't need Marcellus, you don't need Mort Wealth, you don't need anybody. And you do it by yourself, you make more than 20-25% returns. Not only is your compounding healthy, it does not matter when you start this, when you end this. Every year you do this over a 10-year period, you'll make with a very low volatility. Volatility of this is as similar to that of a Government of India bond, measured by standard deviation for time periods longer than 3 years. With a Government of India bond volatility, you get healthy returns. Now, on these companies which come out from the first two filtering criteria, which are barely a couple of dozen, we then go to the next step, which is slide 6, Abhishek, where we look at the barriers to entry, trying to understand. And this is the step where, I mean, 99% of our efforts by measure of time are invested. It typically takes us 10 to 15, at times 18 months to get convinced about any company before we buy it. We barely ever have been able to convince ourselves in a time shorter than a year. And the work here is to first and foremost understand why was history so beautiful for these companies, right? Why was it that over a 10, 15 year or 20 year long period, right, competition would have evolved, macro would have evolved, GDP growth rates would have gone up or down, right? Too many disruptions would have come about. Even internally, the CEO would have retired, CXOs would have changed, promoter would have gone through succession planning through his generations. And even, I mean, various capital allocation decisions would have been taken, and the scale of the business would have changed. In many cases, people believe that smaller companies, it's easier to grow them. Larger companies, once they become large, it's like elephants can't dance, etc. So the historical understanding of why none of these risk factors could dampen the fundamental compounding run rate of the firm is at the heart of understanding from history what these companies are made up of. Now, typically, using actually a little bit of medical lingo, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand the DNA of an organization, right? We are not so much just trying to understand the outcome of the efforts put in over the last decade or two by this company. We're trying to understand the DNA, because it's very hard to change the DNA overnight. If the DNA isn't strong enough, then it becomes very speculative to sort of expect anything by means of healthy fundamentals with a high degree of certainty going forward into the future, right? Now, why do we want to do this? Why do we want to understand the DNA, understand the history, and then invest in these companies? The main reason is, just go to the next slide, Abhishek, please. If you look at the nature of outcome of these companies, right? If you look at this slide on the top right, it shows you last 7 decades of fundamentals of Asian Paints, right? This is a company which I'm sure everybody is aware of, but what most people are not aware of is the degree of consistency this business has delivered for a time period as long as 7 decades in the past, where here the vertical bars are decadal revenue CAGRs in the chart on top right, right? In the chart on top right, the vertical bars are decadal revenue CAGRs, and the two lines, the dotted one is return on capital and the solid one is profit margin. They have not only not shown any volatility, their quantum of growth has been very, very consistent and healthy, right? You've never had, I mean, this chart doesn't show you the impact of all those risk factors that are talked about: GDP growth, raw material price increase, decrease, rupee depreciation, or real estate demand, or paint competition, or whatever, right? In fact, from amongst the 4 promoter families which started this business, one of the promoters exited in '97. That even didn't rock the boat, right? So it's the lack of risk involved in delivering this, which is a bigger objective of this philosophy. And return obviously has to be healthy, and 20% is a very healthy outcome, right? Now, why is this sort of quite logical, obvious, but I mean, I would say very difficult to do, because every fund manager, every investor realizes that Asian Paints is a good quality business. I don't think anybody doubts that, right? The challenge is most of those 99% of the investors who buy Asian Paints, they also believe that Maruti is also similar in quality, right? Similarly, many investors, they believe that Hindustan Unilever and Nestle are of similar quality, right? Which actually is not the case. To us, they are chalk and cheese, right? Maruti is a good company, not at all great. Likewise, Hindustan Unilever. But Nestle, Asian Paints, HDFC Bank, Dr. Lal, Pidilite, they are miles apart in terms of their quality, and hence the ability to deliver low risk, healthy return of compounding of fundamentals and share price over a long period of time. And it's the lack of understanding of that difference which is quite important, probably the only differentiation that we offer here. Now, what is this difference really? So let me give you a simple litmus test example, litmus test construct, which you can use to understand the difference. So many of you might have come across this concept of pricing power, right? The standard textbook definition of pricing power is that if raw material cost goes up, can you hike your product prices and still retain your market share? As in, when you hike your product prices, you've obviously protected your margins against raw material cost inflation. In the meanwhile, can you also ensure that the customer doesn't run away on hiking product prices? If yes, you have pricing power. If no, you don't, right? That's the textbook definition, but it's actually an incomplete definition. That's a misleading definition. Why? Because most business battles are actually fought around price cuts, not so much price hikes, right? And if you were to complete this definition around price cuts, then it should be that if I'm offering a product to my customer at 100 rupees and a competition comes in and decides to offer similar quality product to the same customer at 50, 60, 70 rupees, a deeply discounted price point, right? Then will the customer switch? If he will switch, then I don't have adequate pricing power, because in order to retain him, I'll have to cut my product prices as well and hence compromise on profitability. But if I can be comfortable that it doesn't matter to me because the customer will keep buying from me at 100, despite being very well aware that a similar quality product is available at a 30 to 50% discounted price point elsewhere, right? Then I can say I have the true pricing power. So consider say a Unilever versus a Nestle on this front, right? So once every 3-4 years, there'll be a Patanjali giving a half price product as a competition to Unilever. There'll be a Nirma doing the same. Ghadi detergent from North India. There'll be Colgate offering buy one get one free, or P&G doing buy 5 kg Tide detergent get 3 kg free, etc. Right? So you'll see cutthroat price related competition every once in a while against Unilever's products, and every time Unilever's response is that I will protect my dominance against competition by also matching the lower price points, right? As an outcome, the dominance is retained, but profitability compromised, and hence if you buy and hold a Unilever, Hindustan Unilever in your portfolio, the profit compounding will be never more than 8, 10, 12% on the long term. And in order to compound the share price at 20%, you'll have to do the exciting mumbo jumbo, right? Buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high, which is something that we all get intuitively taught by speaking to most of our friends, etc. That's the way to make money in the stock market. Actually, that's the way to lose money more than make money in the stock market. Whereas if you look at a Nestle, right, 70% of profits for Nestle are generated from baby foods. This is Cerelac, Nanpro, Lactogen, Nestum, etc. Right? Forget about any price war. We've not seen competition to Nestle's products in baby food category, right? So much so that neither have we seen Britannia, Dabur, Patanjali enter, right, as new players, nor have we seen Abbott, Similac, or Danone's Farex. And all the pediatrician on the calls would remember Farex used to be owned by Glaxo at one point of time, or Amul Spray. even these incumbent large balance sheet hitherto dominant players have not been able to give anything in the definition of competition to Nestle, right? And hence, as long as mothers of this country go to work incrementally more and more, affordability of households rises, infants of this country will increasingly be fed with formula milk. And if there's nobody competing against Nanpro or Cerelac, then you as shareholders just have to hold on to Nestle in the portfolio. Profits will compound at 18, 20, 22%, regardless of external or internal disruptions that might be happening to various companies. And you will not have to do the exciting mumbo jumbo of buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high in order to compound your share price at 20% from a Nestle, right? That's the difference. If you can throw the risk of market timing out from the equation of investing, there's nothing more rewarding than that, right, for a shareholder. And this is where, I mean, the comparisons that I was talking about. So a Kia or a Hyundai, when they give 10% extra dealer margin against Maruti's, Maruti also has to match, like Unilever, with the higher dealer margin. Otherwise, Swift Desire loses market share to Hyundai Accent, right? Which is not the case with Asian Paints, right? If a Kotak offers 6% savings interest rate, it doesn't mean HDFC Bank has to match it. HDFC Bank keeps gunning out the savings account growth and current account growth on an ongoing basis. So take for instance the example of your industry, Dr. Lal Path Labs in North and East India, right? It doesn't matter what does Dr. Dang do, what does Metropolis do, what Thyrocare, this or that. It just does not matter. Customers will keep getting their blood tests and urine tests going through Dr. Lal more and more and more, and you've got a great pricing power player there, right? So that's in effect the outcome. Abhishek, let's go to the next slide once. What this means is, I mean, in order to understand these companies, right, you have to not just look at the here and now, right? The here and now is the section on the left hand side here, where you're saying that, look, this is some understanding of the industry, the revenue growth potential, etc. I'll forecast an earnings growth. I'll forecast a return on capital. I'll try to understand the competitive advantages that exist here and now. That itself, I would say, is pretty difficult, but I must say at least 10% of the fund managers out there are able to do this, right? But what is difficult is the right hand half of this slide, which is the softer aspect. How can you be sure that the company is not just great today, even 3, 5, 7 years down the line, it will retain its greatness? How can you be sure that it will keep deepening its existing competitive strengths? It will keep adding new and new layers of revenue growth on an ongoing basis to the business. And most importantly, it will keep disrupting itself once every 5 or 10 years so that no competition, either because of balance sheet strength or some tech disruption, can take away the profit compounding of this company, right? And on top of all of this, it's the most, I would say, the softest aspect of DNA, which is the succession planning piece that the extreme right side of this slide shows you, where we're trying to assess whether the board of directors is truly independent, or is it just, I mean, chaddi buddies and langotia yars of the promoter sitting on the board trying to sign off on whatever the promoter wants. Are the CXOs really empowered? If they are they high quality? If they are, then who takes care of their succession? Is it the board, or is it just the CEO? Is it a one-man show? Is it a decentralized business? Right? So on and so forth. So all of those aspects go into then figuring out our understanding of what the business is likely to deliver in the future, not just in terms of next 3 to 5 years earnings growth and cash flow generation, but in terms of longevity, right? And it's the longevity of these businesses which is the biggest value add that they provide to an investor, right? It's the most undervalued aspect of any company's share price, if it is as great as, say, some of these businesses that I talked about, right? So it's the longevity, and it's very difficult to figure out which of the two businesses will deliver better longevity, and that's where our value add comes in. So in a sense, the portfolio that we are running here has only 14 companies, right? We've always had between 12 to 14, no more, no less. The churn in the portfolio is very low. Last 4.5 years that we've been managing money, we've sold only 3 companies, bought only 5. The list of stocks in the portfolio is very, very boring. Some of you might be already aware. Even if you are not, this presentation pack has the list, our website has the list, etc. It's not just being privy to the list of stocks which is the differentiation here. It's actually 2 things. One, not letting a mediocre quality company dilute the quality of the overall portfolio by, for instance, the investor deciding to hold both a Unilever as well as a Nestle, right? Most investors who buy a Nestle, they also buy a Unilever. Most investors who buy an HDFC Bank, they also buy an ICICI Bank. Most who buy Dr. Lal, they also buy a Metropolis, right? If you can avoid dilution of the quality of the portfolio by also buying by also avoiding mediocre companies, that's one value add that we offer, the concentration. And the second is the length of the holding period. So last year when the COVID crisis started, the common perception was that, look, labor workforce won't be invited into households for some time now because of the risk of the virus, and hence people will paint their walls with a lower frequency over the next year or 2, right? Hence, let's sell out of Asian Paints. Let's buy into it later on at some point of time, right? Likewise, when demonetization happened 5 years ago, the view was that, look, it was the cash in the wardrobe which was painting the walls. Now cash in the wardrobe is gone, so walls will be painted less frequently, right? And it's that that cardinal mistake actually, which we avoid as the second big value add. So if you really know why a crisis is actually a blessing in disguise, in a perverse manner, COVID has been a massive blessing in disguise for great quality businesses in India. Then you would actually be happy that yet another black swan event has happened, which will increase the market share by leaps and bounds for this company, and it will help suffocate competition for this company even more. And I should actually stay invested. So those are the only 2 value adds: concentration of the portfolio and length of the holding period. Nothing else really. And the outcome, as I previously told you, is not so much the return. Yeah, I mean, we've delivered more than 25% CAGR historically, but that's not really the outcome. Going forward, you might continue to see 20% odd, but it's the volatility that over any 12-month time period, this portfolio has never delivered a negative return. Over any 3-year time period, it's never delivered less than 15% return. It's the low volatility of those outcomes for different time periods, which is the bigger value add here. So I'll stop here. Abhishek, happy for you to take questions. You can maybe turn the slides to, I'll tell you which slide. So we've published a few books on this concept. Slide number 22 has those books. You can buy them. You don't, honestly speaking, you don't necessarily, as I said, need us if you can actually understand and do the simplicity of this thing by yourself. Yeah, over to you, Abhishek. You can take any questions that people have.
Yeah, thanks, Akshit, for the presentation. If you have any questions, you can please put in the chat box. We will try to answer each one of them. Okay, there is one question that you had sold recently ITC from your portfolio, and that also has a monopoly in cigarettes. And so what was the reason for selling? And if a person is holding ITC since a long time, like 7 to 10 years, is it a good thinking to sell ITC and move to consistent compounders?
So, I mean, we sold ITC about a year ago, and the main reason for that was that whilst the dominance and our belief in the dominance of cigarettes franchise for ITC is unquestioned, we were quite concerned about the recent developments on their capital allocation approach. So till 2017-18, ITC's, I mean, free cash flows were being reinvested back pretty adequately into the business, despite having a 60-65% dividend payout ratio. Over the last couple of years, the cash generation has increased so much that even after now 80% dividend payout ratio, every year ITC is accumulating around 15% of its market cap on the balance sheet as surplus cash flow, right? So every year 12 to 15,000 crores is at least getting accumulated. Today ITC has I think around 40,000 crores of unutilized cash flow on the balance sheet. Now, we try to get our heads around what the firm wants to do with this, and we realize that they have no clear, not a clear enough plan which we could understand. Maybe we are wrong, but it's that jitteriness that we had once we could understand where the surplus cash is going to be used, because of which we decided to sell out of it. And also HDFC Life, which we replaced ITC with in the portfolio, was a company that we had been researching for quite a while, and we increased our conviction levels on it. So rather than add HDFC Life as a sort of one incremental stock to the portfolio, we decided to replace it with the weakest conviction in our existing portfolio, and hence exited from ITC.
Okay. Now there's a question that market is already at an all-time high, and are we late to this party, and is it a good time to invest now also?
Okay, so this is, I think, one of the most commonly asked questions. So I'll give you 2 or 3 answers, and request to everyone, try to think deeply about it. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to make money in stock markets. And by make money, I'm not saying compound at 10%. Ability to compound at 20% will be always compromised every time somebody asks this question. So market in India is not high quality. Nobody should invest in the market. We are not investing in the market, right? Let me define that a little. As I said, 90% of the listed universe is an accounting fraud to begin with. Most of the clean account companies are weak in their competitive advantages, right? As a result, if you really see what has the market ever delivered, last 6-7 years, the market's profit after tax compounding has been zero, absolutely zero, right? There's a slide on this. Yeah, so Abhishek, do you want to go to the annexure? I think slide number 24 or 25. Yeah, this one. So if you look at the bottom most row, that's Nifty 50, right? Over the last 3-6 years, its profit after tax compounding is zero, right? Zero for the last 3 years, 4% for the last 6 years, right? So this is what market for you is. Why invest in this asset class at all, right? What you instead should be investing in is very, very few rare stocks which don't move up and down with the market, which don't move up and down with the economy, right? And hence, we never advise anybody to buy the market, right? Over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, actually, ever since Sensex Nifty got created, the compounding run rate of the index has been similar to India's GDP growth, right? Never more than that at best, right? 10, 11, 12% is what the market has delivered. It has never delivered sort of 15, 20% over long periods of time, right? India's nominal GDP also grows at 10, 11, 12%, in fact, higher, right? So the market doesn't even give you higher than nominal GDP growth in this country, and hence your lifestyle cost inflation is also not surpassed if you invest in the quote unquote market, right? Whereas look at the US industry, for instance, US markets, when you invest in S&P 500, the long-term compounding rate of that index is 9-10%. The nominal GDP growth of that country is only 3-4-5%. And cost of lifestyle inflation, cost inflation is barely 4-5-6%, even for the higher socioeconomic stratas of the society. So if you invest in the market there, it's adding a lot of value. It's compounding at a faster pace than the economy. It's compounding at a faster pace than your expected, let's say, financial growth that you want. But here in India, it doesn't. So market actually doesn't make sense, first and foremost. Now, secondly, these companies, right, if you buy an Asian Paints, over the last 25 years, there have been 10 years, financial years, 1st April to 31st March, when the stock market has delivered a negative return. Over the last 15, 16 years, 25 years, there have been 15, 16 years of positive return on a 1-year basis and 10 years of negative return for Sensex. Asian Paints has delivered a positive return in 8 out of those 10 years when the market has fallen. Right. So in 8 out of the 10 years when Sensex delivered a negative return, Asian Paints delivered a positive return. In the remaining 2 years, the subsequent year saw Asian Paints deliver some 40-50% return once it went into the negative territory with the market. Right. So that's the resilience of these companies, and hence, I mean, market, we don't know whether it is expensive or not. All we know is that even if it were to fall, it doesn't matter. Just to give you an example, the crash of last year, COVID crash, right? From peak to trough, market fell by around 30-35%. Our portfolio fell by only 12%, right? And whilst the market took a good 6-7 months to get back to pre-crash levels, our portfolio is back to pre-crash levels in less than 2 months, right? So this market question is redundant at multiple fronts. So yeah, I mean, that's how I think I would answer it.
So if a person is coming now in the Marcellus portfolio, will you be buying the same stocks, which everybody knows the names you just said, or you will be buying something new?
No, we'll be buying one portfolio for all our clients at any point of time, right? I mean, one of several hundred misconceptions that people have is कि अगर एक किसी क्लाइंट के लिए 1000 रुपए पे कोई स्टॉक खरीदा था जो आज 2000 रुपए का है, तो पुराने वाले का तो होल्ड कर लो, नए वाले के लिए वो मत खरीदो, राइट? अगर नए वाले के लिए वो मत खरीदो तो पुराने वाले का भी बेचना चाहिए, और अगर पुराने वाले का होल्ड करो तो नए वाले के लिए भी खरीदना चाहिए, राइट? बिकॉज either both will make money from here on into the future, or both will not, right? So we've got just one portfolio at any point of time which all our clients have. Obviously the portfolio keeps changing, right? So there's a 7-8% annual churn because of stock entry exit, and there's another 7-8% annual churn because of rebalancing. So for instance, last year when Bajaj Finance fell by 70%, we more than doubled our position in Bajaj Finance, right? Now, obviously, this is something which just the list of stocks doesn't give you, right? And these changes add a lot of value. But whenever these changes are happening to one client in our portfolio, they'll be happening to the other client as well. So yes, we'll be buying the same portfolio as we've been buying till yesterday for a particular client, if a client comes today.
Okay, thank you. So the minimum amount you accept for investment would
That's
be
50 lakhs, which is the regulatory minimum.
Yeah, 50 lakhs. Okay. So one more question is on Asian Paints. That Asian Paints has a very high price earning multiple. So how are you comfortable buying it at this price earning multiple?
Yeah. So there's a slide, should be number 14. CCP companies have delivered FCFE CAGR of 25%. Can you project that, Abhishek?
Slide number 14. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is for the non-financial stocks in our portfolio. For financials, free cash flow by the formulaic definition doesn't make sense, hence we haven't included them here. For the non-financial stocks in our portfolio, this is what the free cash flow compounding historically has been. And you can see Asian Paints in the second row, right? Asian Paints and every other company. Whether you look at the last 20 years in total, or divide it into time periods of 10 years, or divide it into time periods of 5 years, the rate of compounding of free cash flow of these businesses is no less than around 25%. Right? Now, if these businesses can deliver a similar sort of 20-25% compounding even over the future, and if you're convinced about it, then what happens is, so Abhishek, if you can go to the valuation slide, which is slide 27 and 28. So slide number 27 and 28. So think about it like this: the PE multiple or the share price of any stock. Yeah, this slide. The share price of any stock is a combination of, or in a mathematical way, it's a product of P by E and E, right? Price to earnings multiplied by earnings is the share price, right? So when you do change in price, it's more or less an addition of the percentage change in P multiple and the percentage change in earnings, right? Now, just click once, Abhishek, a few times, and the slide will populate. Yeah. So if you then say that, look, let's go for company where earnings growth is zero. And there are many such companies. I would say 70-80% of the listed universe is zero earnings growth, more or less, right? I showed you Nifty 50 has zero earnings growth, right? Over the last 5-6 years, Nifty 50 earnings growth is zero. 10 years, Nifty earnings growth is 4%, right? So if the earnings growth is more like zero for a company, right, then over a 10-year period, PE multiple oscillates broadly between doubling and halving. PE multiple is an oscillating factor. It's not a compounding factor. You never see PE multiple go from 5 times to 50 times to 500 times to 5,000 times, right? PE multiple is only an oscillating factor, and the oscillations happen between doubling and halving. And hence, if you pick up a zero earnings growth, doubling of PE, let's say you pick up a great market timer fund manager who has hand of God on his head, who can tell you when the PE multiple is at the bottom and when it is at the top. That hand of God will help you compound at 7% on the PE multiple on an annualized basis over a 10 if it doubles, and it'll be minus 7% if it halves, right? With the zero earnings growth, it doesn't matter. Your outcome will be equally bad, right? Neither will you be happy with +7 or -7 on your portfolio, right? Let's do a couple of more clicks. Now, if you then say that, okay, I'm not as bad at stock picking, I'll pick up a zero earnings growth compounder. I'll pick up a Unilever, Maruti. There are various others. I mean, L&T and companies which compound earnings at 8, 10, 12% CAGR, right? In these companies, if you add a PE doubler or PE halving over a 10, it's a band of say 20% and 5% CAGR, and a hand of God on his head fund manager will give you a 20% with doubling of PE on top of 12% earnings compounding, right? And hence this becomes the way we've understood that in the Western world, people like whoever, Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, and Howard Marks, and everybody, whenever they've tried to time entry exits, this is what they've actually ended up achieving. And honestly speaking, they've done this. Now, in India, there's some unique aspect, which is the last two rows. In India, you can have companies, and this is unique to India. You can have companies like, say, the Asian Paints, Pidilite, and all the companies that 2 minutes back I showed you in the slide on free cash flow compounding, where the free cash flow compounding, despite having attracted a lot of competition, doesn't stop and it doesn't slow down, right? If you can compound earnings in your portfolio at say 25%, 20%, right? Then doubling or halving of PE multiple is a redundant contribution to the outcome of this equation, right? If you're going to be happy with 18% in the worst case scenario, then I don't think you really want 32% for the risk of market timing, right? You'll be happy staying invested if the worst case is also very acceptable to you. So that's really what we're looking forward to here, right? We don't know whether Asian Paints' PE will halve or double over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. All we know is that if Asian Paints keeps compounding earnings and profits and cash flows at say 20-25%, then doubling or halving of PE is not going to have any impact on the nature of the outcome, which is going to be a happy outcome.
Now there are a couple of questions on what are the charges and fee structure, and what is the time horizon we should look at to make this kind of return of 18-20% if we are coming to Marcellus?
Yeah, so charges, fee structure, I'll highlight broadly, and Abhishek, Subhash, and all can send you the sort of details on these in an email, etc. So first, let me answer the time horizon question. So it depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for capital protection, 1 year is good enough, right? If you stay invested in this over a 1 year period, there is almost negligible probability of losing money, even in the worst of stock market crashes, like say COVID last year. Over a 1 year period, losing money is a very, very low negligible probability. If you're looking at say minimum 10% CAGR, right, 10% annualized return, then 2 years is good enough, right? You stay invested in this portfolio for 2 years, PE halving, doubling, market crashing, going up, whatever, doesn't matter. At least 10% is what you'll get. If you're looking for at least 15%, then that's where you'll have to stay invested for at least 3 years. And thereafter, whether you stay invested for 5 years or 7 years, the band of outcomes will remain very narrow, say between 15-16% at the bottom and 24-25% at the top. The band of outcomes will remain narrow. The average obviously will be at around say 20, and the longer the better, right? If you don't need the money, you should stay invested. This is not a limited time period philosophy. This is not a uniqueness which we see going away from India over the next 5 years or 10 years.
And the fee structure?
So the fee structure has, I mean, there are 3 options. Whichever one you want to choose, you can. And there are different mindsets which prefer different options. And every year we also give an opportunity to all our clients to change the fee structure. So the one option is go for complete fixed fees, where the fixed fees is 2%, and you don't pay any performance fees on top, right? The second option is completely variable fees, where fixed fees is 0. There is an annual hurdle rate of 8%, which is sort of the risk-free rate. Whatever you generate above 8%, you share 20% of that profit with us, and till 8% is free for you completely. There's no fixed fees till 8%. There's no performance fees either, right? So in this second structure, the mindset is that look, if I'm going to make very weak return, why should I pay any fees? And if I'm going to make very strong return, I don't mind paying higher than normal fees. And that's the mindset which chooses the performance fee structure. The mindset which chooses the fixed fee structure is that look, I'll be invested with Marcellus only if I believe they can deliver a healthy return. If I believe they are not going to deliver a healthy return, if I have my doubts, then I'll not be invested with Marcellus, rather than be invested and then be happy with a low fee structure on variable fees for lower returns, right? So what we've typically seen is initially when people haven't understood what we do very deeply, they choose the variable fee structure. Over a period of time, as they understand that what we are doing actually is low risk, high return compounding, then they say that, well, I think these guys are going to beat the sort of break-even point of around 18-19% for the 2 fee structures when you compare them against each other. So let me choose the fixed fee structure. Why should I pay every time they deliver when these companies deliver a great quality of compounding? So yeah, so that's those are the, and then there's a third one which is a hybrid, a little here, a little there. You can pay 1% fixed fees in that, and on top there is a 12% hurdle instead of 8, and 15% profit share instead of 20. Yes, these are annual fees. Some Anupam,
Yeah.
Dr. Bagdi is asking. These are annual fees. Yes.
So 2% fixed fee model, it's annual fee and would be deducted quarterly from your portfolio.
Yeah, 0.5% every quarter, and this is annual.
So we're taking last 2 questions. I would request doctors to put any questions they have. So the book in the middle, which you see, is also co-authored by Rakshit himself, and I would strongly recommend to buy this book. It's free on Audible right now, and you can also buy the hardcover copy on Amazon.
There's also lots of blogs and newsletters. If you want, you should actually, not just if you want. It's your hard-earned money. I mean, I've seen doctors and businessmen who say that, look, we are quite busy with our day job. We don't have time to go through published material of yours. But this is your money. It's very, very easy for somebody to give a nice marketing pitch, and hence you have to see through the real quality of the underlying philosophy and the fund management team. So please take out time. If you are interested, you should go through all this. On our website, it's freely available: newsletters, blogs, webinars, etc.
Yeah, so Mr. Firoz Khan is asking that, is this annual fee will be charged irrespective of whether portfolio makes profit or loss? So sir, there are two options, as Rakshit explained. This is a fixed fee option. You are correct. It will be charged irrespective of profit or loss. But in the variable fee option, until the portfolio makes 8% return, you will be charged nothing.
And there's also high watermark. So let's say if your 100 rupee went up to 120 in year one, you paid a fees, but then 120 becomes a high watermark. If from 120, the value of your portfolio went down to, let's say, 80 in the next year for whatever reason, although it won't dip so much, but if 120 went down to 80, you don't pay fees in the second year. In the third year, if 80 goes to 110, that's a good 35% return, but you still don't pay any fees because you didn't cross the high watermark of 120. So it's only when you've crossed the high watermark and you have generated more than 8% annual return that you pay the fees.
Okay. I think we've run out of the questions now. Thanks a lot, Rakshit, for your time. And I give this to Siddharth. Siddharth?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Rakshit, sir, for taking the time out and addressing the conference. It was really a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for dialing in. Thanks, Moat Wealth, for hosting it. Bye.
Yes. I also wanted to thank all the members of the association for giving us your valuable time. And I also wanted to give a special thanks to Dr. Waghela and Dr. Kade. They approved it on the very first decision when I requested them for a presentation. So I want to thank you, give you a very big thank you. And I look forward to connecting with us. If anyone would like to connect with us, we'll be sharing the numbers, so you can connect to us there.
You can share, Siddharth. I made you the host.
Yes, sir. Tejas, sir. So if you would like to...
Can you do a slideshow? Full screen?
Yes, sir.
And Siddharth is based in Akolo itself. It's a local resident. So if you have any doubts or queries, so you can speak to him. And if you want to have a meeting, he can come down and meet you all.